read it out this question because I don't want to lose any essence. An important feature of our imagining of past is the centrality of empires, a notion that is essentially invention of prominent Indian historiography and textbooks. Even in the good old times of NCERT, the rise and fall of empires was presented chronologically as the central binding narrative, imposing the modern Indian nation state onto every large political territorial structure of past, which creates an impression of contemporary India as unified cultural and political.
Just a minute. Zara dheere padho, please.
Okay. So, should I repeat?
What's the question?
Yeah. Cultural and political continuity, even emergence of regional historiography considered as fulfilling gaps or extension of a large Indian story. In this given context, how should we reimagine textbook of subcontinent?
How should we just repeat the last
Okay.
bit?
So, should I ask? Repeat
No. Just the last bit. Please
Is this
repeat the
given-
last bit.
What's the question?
In this
That-
given
what is
context,
it?
how should we reimagine textbook of subcontinent?
How should we reimagine
Textbooks of subcontinent.
subcontinent? Please, it's not clear.
So that come this side.
Ha, come. He's got a long preface summarizing you. Shall we take another question in the meanwhile? Let's have another question in the meanwhile because Neeladri is going to read this.
Hello, sir and ma'am. My question is from Professor Romila Thapar, ma'am. Ma'am, you said that history is not static, it's ever-evolving discipline.
History is धीरे बोलो and जोर से बोलो.
Ma'am, you said that history keeps changing.
History keeps changing.
So, ma'am, how can we balance the idea of historical truth with changing interpretations? This is my first question.
Wait, stop. How can we balance
The idea of historical truth
Okay, that
with the changing interpretations.
okay.
This is my first question. And
And you better wait for get the answer and then you repeat your.
To which
It's working. Wait.
it is working. To which I have a simple answer, which is that the historian is not seeking the truth. The historian is seeking to explain what happened. And there's a lot of difference between the two. If you say the historian is seeking the truth, then you're stuck with a static history, which will not change, which will have an ideological base and will go on being repeated in book after book, year after year. But if you are a proper historian that recognizes explaining change, then you understand that your purpose is to explain the changes that went on in the past.
ma'am, my another question with you is that today is the age of misinformation and social media, as we all know. So
Today is the age of misinformation and social media. Okay.
So how can history help young people distinguish between fact, interpretation, and propaganda?
Acha.
Well, history is not there to correct necessarily what goes on in the social media. The point that needs to be emphasized is that social media, what appears on WhatsApp and your Facebook and this, that, and the other, this is not necessarily history. History is what is written and accepted by professional historians who put out a thesis which is discussed, and it's either accepted or it's thrown out. That's history, because it's a proper discussion based on evidence, proven evidence, not fantasy, It's based on evidence, it's based on logical and rational analysis. And it's based on an explanation that is viable. So that's history. The rest of it can be bakwas or it can be very good. It depends on the person who's doing it. And you have to be careful, because if you're picking up your history from the media, you have to always cross-check whether it is acceptable or not to the professional historian. There's no harm. The media is there for people to say what they like. It should be a free society where anybody can say what they like. But when you say what you like on the media, please do not say, this is the truth. It's not.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Arpan. I'm a PhD scholar at Shiv Nadar University. My question is to Professor Romila Thapar and
Where? Yeah.
so
Yeah,
my question is to Professor Romila Thapar and Neeladri Bhattacharyya.
Just speak up, please,
yes.
a little bit more. Huh?
What we see is that when she was giving her talk, we sort of see that there are different paradigms through which the truth of historical knowledge has been produced. The colonial, then we came the Orientalist, then the nationalist. But I was wondering that where do ethnographic reports, the surveys that the colonial state in the making were conducting across different regions, are figuring in her narrative of creating an image of an Indian past. And in that, we also see that when regional history writings were going on, we sort of see that there is a lot of reproduction of the categories and assumptions that were created within that colonial production of knowledge, and also how nationalists took on to those categories and assumptions. So in that sense, we also see there is also a lot of ethnographic inputs that were also taken up. So where do we sort of fit in those survey reports that were coming up in the production of knowledge about India's past about different societies that were inhabiting India at that point of time? Yeah.
Okay. If I have to summarize it, can I say that
Sure.
it was to where is the discussion of the ethnography that is being generated at the same time, and where does that figure in the historical writing? Is that right? Especially in the context of regional history.
When we look at, I'll answer this and also the earlier first question. When we look at ethnography, we have to see it as a possible source for historians, but we have to understand how the ethnographical work happened. That is, who was interviewing, who was collecting, what was his position, what was his power, and how does that position and power defines the questions he asked in collecting the evidence, and how does that question define the answer from the field that he's getting. So we have to look at the ethnographic situation as a power-laden situation between the interviewer and the interviewee, which produces the ethnographic material and evidence, and that ethnographic material is problematic, needs to be understood, unpacked, read, and then used to the extent that we can. So therefore, it's neither to be dismissed as unimportant, like British ethnography. Therefore, we have to look at the structures of colonial thought in producing that ethnography. And once we critique that, we can still use it, but aware of the problems of that material that we are collecting. So it's to be used, but critically. Ask questions about the ethnography before using it as fact or evidence. That's true of all the ethnographic surveys that the British did. The earlier question which was asked, which, sorry, I couldn't follow from a distance, essentially, if I understand it, the question was that history has been written as history of big empires, and when the regions come up, how do we relate the history of the region to that history of empire? If I understand, that's the question. So in two different ways. One is that there was a stage of history writing where history of the nation or the world was seen as a history of empire. the region did not count. It is the focus was entirely on the so-called dynamic empires, which are conquering, taking over, subjugating, transforming, and creating the world in the image of those who dominate that empire. And it becomes a battle of empires, from the Ottoman to Christendom, and in India you have from Ashokan times to Gupta times to Mughal times. It's the entire focus was on the empires, and the regions were not looked at adequately, and regions were looked at as the victims of conquest. They came into historical picture and visibility when the emperor, building the empire, conquered a particular region and subjugated a ruler. Now, when regional histories began, and that's your question, when the regional histories began, very often it took two different forms. One is that the region was seen as insulated and isolated from empires, from the wider world, and therefore insular parochial histories of regions were written. Now that's problematic, but these histories also produced another kind of more critical regional history, which recognizes that the regional development is important, but the region also interacts with the wider imperial forces, the wider empire, and even the global world, and how all that interacts in ways which transforms both the region as well as the empire. So the empire, the imperial politics is redefined through the region, and the region is redefined through the empire. That would be my answer to that. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I would only say that I think at the end of my life that empire as a concept needs to be reconsidered. We have treated empire as a huge territory that somehow engulfed all the little bits. And when the hugeness cracked, the little bits came up as kingdoms. That's not how an empire functions. I did hint at this, more than hinted at, in a little book I wrote called The Mauryas Reconsidered, which has been much attacked by left historians particularly, because I question the notion of a uniform, solitary empire absorbing everything. I think that empires have to be studied in terms of their individual relationships with the regions that they conquer. And those individual relationships can be quite different from one end to the other. So it's really very necessary to go back once again and ask the question, what do we mean by empire? Because what the definition that is currently used is a definition which I think simply does not hold. My other quarrel, I may as well mention it, is with the term and the concept civilization, which again is a uniform inducting term, which it never was. It was always, interfaces between cultures doing this. And that's much more fascinating because that links up with not only the regional history and so on, it links up a great deal with what went into the making of what we call our cultural heritage. It wasn't a straight line. There were all sorts of things coming in, and those things have to be studied and given attention to.
That's great. Even I'll put in a little bit over there. In the experiment that we had in Delhi University, when we were we were doing a much-needed exercise of rewriting the syllabus in the early 80s. We tried to put in the thrust has been the Gangetic Valley. The Gangetic Valley has dominated the history of the country, and we were trying to break from that. So we wanted a course, because South India had been sufficiently researched, there was a fair body of material, and so on. We thought that we should have one course on which included a region. And we thought over a period of time it could shift to the northeast, it could shift to other places and so on. it was the most fiercely contested part of the syllabus making, and it was left, right, everybody came, jumped on us and refused to let us have that course because it was disintegrating the idea of the unity of the Indian nation, and therefore the unity of Indian history as confined to roughly the Gangetic Valley. More. One here. Let's go.
गुड आफ्टरनून मैम. मेरा सवाल रोमिला मैम से रहेगा. मैम, जब आपने मार्क्सिस्ट इंटरप्रिटेशन ऑफ
जरा जोर से बोलो और माइक के अंदर बोलो.
रोमिला मैम, मेरा सवाल आपसे रहेगा. गुड आफ्टरनून मैम. मेरा नाम तोमजीत मलिक है. मैम, आपने मार्क्सिस्ट इंटरप्रिटेशन ऑफ हिस्ट्री का बात किया, मार्क्सिस्ट वे ऑफ स्टडीइंग द एवोल्यूशन ऑफ सोसाइटी का बात किया. बट मैम, जब हम इंडियन हिस्टोरियोग्राफी का बात करते हैं तो सबल्टन हिस्ट्री का इसमें पर्टिकुलरली क्या इम्पैक्ट रहा, एंड मार्क्सिस्ट अप्रोच से इसका इम्पैक्ट जो था वो कैसे अलग था, एंड दोनों में आज के दिन ज़्यादा रिलेवेंट आपके हिसाब से कौन सा वाला, ये एक बार प्लीज़ बताइएगा. थैंक यू.
सबॉल्टन बोला.
हाँ, सबॉल्टन स्टडीज का उसका इम्पैक्ट मार्क्सिस्ट इम्पैक्ट से कैसे अलग था, एंड हाउ इज इट मतलब रिलेवेंट इन टुडेज डायनामिक्स. थैंक यू मैम.
हाँ, he is wanting a response to the paradigms that we've been talking about. Where does the subaltern history feature in all of that? That's what I understood. वो है ना आपका सवाल? ठीक है.
Should I repeat my question, ma'am?
नहीं, समझ आ गया.
ठीक है, thank you.
Marxist history is not just of one type. There are many traditions of Marxist history. There are certain kinds of orthodoxies within Marxism which define Marxist history in one way, which is critiqued by creative, critical Marxists like E.P. Thompson and others, and which have subsequently been critiqued also. There is a debate about what Marxist history, which is a wider debate, which I'm not going into. We can discuss it some. But the E.P. Thompson kind of Marxist history, which argued that Marxist history cannot or should not be only that history which looks at transformation and change purely through economic changes, but it should look at culture, ideas, customs and norms, rituals and practices, all form everything within society and their relationship to the economy, rather than the economy as the motor of history. And he redefined Marxist history in a creative way. Now, this history from below that he inspired is also something which inspires subaltern studies. So the shift from a focus on history from above to history from below is something which is paralleled in the subaltern shift from the history of the elites to the history of the subalterns, of the lower class. And the history of the subaltern doesn't mean, in the early writings of the subaltern, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is a history about the subaltern. It is a history which looks at history from the point of view of the subaltern, their experiences. Again, E.P. Thompson's argument that experience counts. How did the people down there, the workers and the peasants and the artisans, how did they see the world? What was their perception? What was their experience? We as historians need to listen to them, to hear them, to feel them, to empathize with them, to understand them before we can write about them. This is what they were saying. And subaltern studies in some way was trying to build on these kind of insights by arguing that we should move away from the state and the dominant classes, the elite groups, and dismissed the earlier historians as elitist to argue that we should look at the world through the peasants and the workers and other social groups. But subaltern studies changed over time, and this is not the insight which informed the subaltern studies after volume 3 or 4. They were then influenced by post-colonialism, post-structuralism, the linguistic turn, the cultural turn, a whole series of turns where subaltern studies stood for and tried to stand for radical critical history which questions earlier forms and integrates new insights into the writing of history, but which no longer focuses on the subaltern. Partha Chatterjee wrote on Gandhi, he wrote on the princely impostor. There are other writings of people who have written on the state and dominant classes and groups. Those are not any longer a focus on the lower groups, nor is there an attempt to look at the world through their eyes. The focus on the discourses, the nationalism as a derivative discourse is not subaltern studies in the old sense of the term. So there is a connection, but no direct connection.
Yeah, I would just like to say to that I think the subaltern studies school and their history writing was a very necessary intervention. It was the time when Indian history was getting ready to had opened out to the social sciences and other ways of thinking. Theories of explanation were being applied in all kinds of ways. So it was a very good intervention in terms of saying, look, you have to look at this area of history as well. You have to look at another social strata. You cannot just go on looking at elite groups. My problem with it, however, was, and this is something that some of us have discussed, it focused entirely on the early modern and modern history.
Exactly.
It doesn't make any comment on what happened before 1500 AD. Now, if you're really going to introduce subaltern history, you have to do it from the start. I was very struck by this when I read an absolutely brilliant essay by Gayatri Spivak on Can the Subaltern Speak, where she discusses sati. And she discusses it very, very lucidly, coherently, brilliantly in relation to modern Indian studies and the modern status of women. Now, sati goes back to the 5th century AD. And I just wish that she had turned to some of us and said, do these ideas fit in with any of the theories that you may have? And we could have done a sort of combined study, which I still hope somebody from the pre-modern history stock will do. And that the point about these kinds of interventions is that not that they provide total answers, and you say, here's the answer, QED. It's, what about this? Have you thought about this? And then people start thinking about it. And that's the way knowledge advances. You keep questioning what is existing, and then you get something new. If you turn around and say, no.
You want to say something?
Just a small announcement.
Well, I think you have to clarify that teaching a course is according to the syllabus and is important for examinations. So please, learn the course, learn what you have to, learn how to answer exam questions. But the syllabus has a context. And in order to understand what you're teaching and understand, you have to know the context. So please expand your reading and your understanding to include that context. Now, I agree that it's a very problematic situation, because then you get an exam question and you start answering it in terms of the context and you get 0. So you have to be very clear about what is needed. I mean, that's the worst thing about these kinds of syllabi and examinations, question answer. So you've got to learn the catechism, the question, the answer required, etc., and keep that aside for the exam. But for the interest in the subject, you have to read the context. So it's a hell of a chore, but never mind, do it.
What are you going to do? I think we should have a clear picture. There.
Hello.
Put your hand there. Take those 3 charts. I mean, here the sequence में Question.
So good evening panelists and good evening professors. My name is Aditya. I'm from Hansraj College. So my question is directed to the entire panel. So suppose after critical analysis a historian or a scholar comes across something which may leads to violence between two communities, or sometimes it creates some sort of hatred or ambiguity, some sort of such situations which may escalate into violence या फिर communal hatred या फिर ऐसा कुछ हो सकता है. So how should a historian present that evidence or that source or that set of information? Should they ignore it just because it may lead to violence, or they should do some other way to present it?
He's saying that there can be issues that can lead to violence. So should you sidestep those things in the history, or should you find a way to deal with them? The things that are potentially creating violence between people. You want to take that?
There are 2-3 things. One is to contextualize every evidence in a way where you locate that in time and space, where you understand something happened at a particular point in time, which is a historical, it was historically specific to the time. To give examples, if you are writing about caste, or if you are writing about Hindu-Muslim kind of relationship in medieval India, so we shouldn't shy away from all evidence of things which happen, whether it is temple destruction, but we should contextualize it. We should see why it happened at that time, what was the logic of it, what was the politics of it, how do we see that thing, and make it clear to students and others in the writing or in writing textbooks, make it clear that we live in a different time. And therefore, that's not the politics of today. But also write about that in that time in a way where we do not hide and repress one kind of evidence and put forward another kind. Like the evidence I was talking about Akbar. You don't talk about the politics of brutality and cruelty without at the same time showing how the same person changes over time, and how the effort to accommodate or bring together people, understand and empathize with the cultures and religion of different kinds of social group is also part of that politics. Then you are actually provoking a certain kind of anger and rage, which is undesirable and problematic. But to say that talking about caste is provoking caste conflict today is something which itself is problematic. That is, you can't say that. That is, becoming aware of repression in the past is a way of transforming society in the present. Therefore, we have to be aware of what happened in the past, the variety of kinds of structures of oppression and repression. And if that leads to creative transformation, that is it. What we shouldn't do is to provoke, write in a way or teach in a way which provokes violence and tension. We have to teach and write in a way which makes people understand and understand that we have to live in a world of dialogue, conversation, mutual understanding and empathy and transformation through that kind of a politics.
I just want to add one sentence, which is, of course, that violence is not just A beating up B. Violence is a very, very complex subject. And what we have to be aware of as citizens of this country is that in every situation of violence, you have to analyze all the features that went into creating that situation. Irrespective of whether they are political, social, economic, or what, but you have to be fair and clear about all the different features. And they change from environment to environment. I mean, every time there is a riot, you know that it's not the same as the riot before. So it's very necessary to analyze the violence and keep that analysis going. That, we must avoid these things in order to avoid violence. Not just say nice things about each other, but go into it.
So I think...
I just wanted to add a little. As historians, we also have certain ethical values as such. Now, what are our ethical values? Compassion, love, affection, opposition to forms of oppression as such. So when we come across examples of violence or conflict, we don't hide it. But remember, when a violence takes place, there are victims, there is sorrow, there is death. Now, can we explore those areas as such? Because violence is not simply victory. It's not simply... So one, as is being pointed out, we contextualize it, but we also learn to look at these things through our eyes, through our inquiries which connect us with larger streams of compassion, of love. Probably that will provide an answer to you about what you want to do.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Thank
अच्छा इनके हाथ में माइक ऑलरेडी है चलो shall we take couple questions हाँ pass it on आप अपना क्वेश्चन पूछो और फिर उनको दे दो फिर पीछे तीन लोग
Okay. Thank you panel for insightful discussion.
क्या जी?
My question is, past is a site of seeking legitimacy and.
माइक पे बोलो.
Past is a site of seeking legitimacy and contesting the legitimacy, and we retrieve the past to historical facts, but also through myths and memory. And when historical facts are at variance with myths and memories, how do we confront that contradictions, so as to say, in the light of the term when Marx writes that all that is solid will melt and all that is sacred will be profaned. So yeah, how does memory and historical fact, when they are at variance, how do we see them? Thank you.
Hello. First of all, a very warm and fresh greetings to the panel, which is very much needed this time. My name is Ashutosh. I am currently pursuing my undergraduate from Hansraj. My question is, so we've studied in our first year that E.H. Carr in his seminal work, What is History, wrote that history is a continuous dialogue between the past and the present. Now, if as per E.H. Carr we go, then now what I feel is that history also encompasses what it includes in its writings and ultimate publication, and what is choose deliberately to silence, deliberately or whatever way. Now, can we say that what we are witnessing currently under this regime and the changes in our textbooks is a part of this continuous dialogue, or maybe as a part of the political history writing of this period? Because if we are choosing something, or we are forced upon something which is silenced to us, so is this the is this what constitutes the dialogue of with history and the present and the past? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
May I add my question, Professor Bhattacharya?
So good evening, ma'am, and all the panelists here. I'm Sakshi. I'm currently pursuing history honors at Miranda House, and
speaking to the mic.
And my question to you is that, as an eminent historians, you all have achieved a great heights in your career, and you all have debunked the pre-existing perceptions in those days, and you have debunked the ideas, you have debunked the entire hierarchical system in the history. So today, with the change in regime, today with a new sort of, we are more exposed to knowledge, we are more exposed to new sort of interpretations. So as an historian, the challenges that you have faced at that time when you were writing, when you were in your college days, and today what we are facing, like new sort of interpretation is coming every day. So how do you cope with those
today, and what is the difference between, because of course censorship is always there and some sort of control in history is always there. So what are the changes with this regime and the regime that was prior? Thank you.
I think we should stop.
I have a short question.
Huh? Is she talking
ठीक है, नहीं भाई बैठी पूछो. Sir,
I think we'll stop for
so I have a question. I would be highly obliged if you can take my question.
Is that we'll take that question. We'll take a last round of questions. Let us just, because otherwise we'll forget the question itself. Okay? So पहले वाले ये तीन ले लेते हैं, then we'll take another round. Is that okay?
नहीं.
Come on. Please.
So Professor, so I have a question, a short question, please. I would be highly obliged if you take my question, Professor Bhattacharya.
We are answering the questions, and after that.
Yeah. Whatever you got to answer.
The first question was on myth, memory, and historical facts. So how do we deal with myth and memory, and how do we differentiate that from facts, and how do historians relate to myths and memory when that is so powerful in returning to and relating to the past? Now, there was a time when myth and memory, historians dismissed myth and memory, saying it's not history, therefore we cannot, that shouldn't be taken seriously. Now, ancient historians were an exception because a large part of their sources was myth and memory. Therefore, analyzing and understanding myth and memory to understand that past was forced upon them, because the history writing in the modern sense or production of factual material in the same sense did not exist in the scale that it exists now. Of course, there were inscriptions, there were archaeological artifacts which we go back to. But the analysis of epics to analysis of myths or Jataka tales and others become part of history writing. But now historians take myth and memory seriously. But you take seriously not by seeing that as fact, as often is done by political groups on the right all over the world, not just in India, that the myth and memory is seen as fact. So whether you are talking of Ganesha or others, you then try to establish the factuality of that myth. That's not the point. But analyzing the myth in order to understand why this myth was produced, what is its structure, what can it tell us about the time which produced that myth. And therefore, by understanding the myth and unpacking the myth, you return to a past which produced the myth, and therefore through that, you understand the world that the myth is producing. And that's how myths are analyzed by historians today. It cannot be reduced to the historical fact or seen as synonymous with historical fact, but we can extract and see and read history through myth and memory too. That's the first thing.
Just to add a little bit to that, one of the reasons why historians turn to looking at myth as a possible kind of source, not a direct source, but a sort of hinting at what might have happened, was the strength that began to be given to the oral tradition. You had a situation in Africa where the Bantu had no written history at all, but a very strong oral tradition. So they have sat and developed ways of analyzing this tradition. Complicated ways, but there are ways. And those have been applied to the epic literature of Eastern Europe, for example, with very interesting results. So we don't now dismiss these things out of hand. We say, let's find a method by which we can understand why this myth was concocted. And that's the important thing, because when you understand why a community creates a myth, you begin to understand something about that community. And that's really very crucial. So this kind of development of oral traditions and mythology and so on, and it may lead to very rude questions about the myth, you know, but the thing is that the historian has to ask those questions and get the answers and see what can be made out of it. It's a detective enterprise, as a lot of history is.
I think the question that the Miranda House student raised, just put it in one sentence, okay? Yeah, repeat it so that the answer, you can get an answer. Just जोर से बोल लो ना.
We are exposed. So I'm asking that. Should I need to again?
It's clear. So,
can I add my questions as well?
इसके बाद, let this be answered.
Well,
तुमको करना है
changes and shifts with changes in political regime can be of different orders. Within the earlier regimes that we have had, I would say I've been critical of Congress for a variety of different reasons, but the institutional structures which developed, whether it is NCRT or ICSSR and others, the institutional structures did not directly, or history in more general, did not directly intervene in shaping history. There was a space within which historians debated and discussed. They had a dialogue. They opposed each other. They did not agree. There were intense conflicts. So this contested history produced new kinds of history and redefined earlier kinds of frames. Right? But when the state gets directly involved in many different ways, that's the undesirable point. That is the point about undesirable revision that I was talking about, that the state direct intervention in the writing of a history of a particular form implies that the ideological pressure and the drive becomes more important in the contestations that take place rather than the intellectual contestation and scholarly debates and discussions. So these are two different kinds of contestations. One is ideological versus scholarly, because what we see is not just a debate at the level of history writing, but there's a wider attack on intellect, on intellectuals in intellectual institutions within society, whereas effort to displace those institutions and within the academia. So that takes on a different form. So all contestations cannot be equated. Very often it is said that, you have had your time, the debate, and now it is our time, we'll do it in the way that we want. But yes, of course, you can shift and change and I have no opposition to right-wing histories. Personally, if it is scholarly, if it is good, if it is written, some of the finest histories in the world have been written by right-wing people. For instance, I'll give one example. About French Revolution, the established orthodoxy was a Marxist history. For a very long time, from Lefebvre onwards to the present, a lot of historians, Marxist historians wrote that. When the revisionist history began to revise that history, from Colin Lucas to Cobb to Furet and others, they questioned everything about the Marxist histories. And I think they are great histories. They are scholars, they have looked at their sources, they have reworked, they have questioned it conceptually, theoretically, and they are producing histories which I may not fully agree with. We can have a dialogue, but those are academic histories. So when academic history is completely displaced, then you have a problem. And that's what we have to see, what kind of contestation, and let's not equate all contestations.
Do you want to say something? No. No, actually, the situation is not simply about the syllabus any longer. It's not only about history writing any longer. It's actually diktats that come from above, which say you can't have a discussion on something. And it has happened recently in Delhi University, where a 65-year-old tradition of, at least 65-year-old tradition of a research colloquium was simply by fiat from the top closed down because, and it was a research colloquium, and they shut it down. So outrageous things are happening from, and it's really not even history, it's much wider. The attack is coming from much wider sources because thinking itself, critical thinking itself is not to be encouraged. So that's a crisis that we are facing. Yeah, please.
I'll just add a little. You see, historians have been arguing with each other about a range of issues, disagreeing. For example, what Marx wrote, people like Koshambi, people like Professor Thapar, they disagreed with him, many of Marx's understandings, and still wrote something which was close to the Marxist tradition of writing. So disagreements are the norm as far as history writing is concerned, and history that is written today will change tomorrow. But this is one kind of history writing where the disagreement or agreements are among historians who are arguing with each other with certain sets of ideas, certain sets of evidences as such. That's one thing. But to get a diktat from certain source and say you have to write this kind of history, that's a different thing altogether. And that probably has to be encountered at a different level. But also as students, since you are facing both these different kinds of histories as such, it's there that you have to learn to apply your own mind, to find out your disagreements, to discover. That's very crucial. All of you are, after all, budding historians. And when you come across one set of ideas, one set of arguments, you yourself should be trying to find out, to discover with the help of other people, with the help of other groups. That is how we will look at the possibility of a future dialogue.
Yeah, sure.
It's here.
I would just like to add one point to what both of them have said quite correctly, and that is that I think one has to be aware of the fact that because in all our disciplines, especially in the social sciences, debate and controversy is normal, absolutely normal. This is something that, if you say, we can't have a debate on this subject, people will look at you, social sciences will look at you and say, what's the matter with you? It's normal. Now, we as the general public have to distinguish between that which is debated and comes out of a controversy and comes from people who are well read in the subject. That's very important. As against others who hold opinions and claim that they have the truth without going through the process of debate, without going through the process of reading. So it is certainly a matter where the academic historian, although God knows we've been accused of being incomprehensible by some popularizers of history, who say the academics are too dense, Indian academics are too dense, therefore people go to the media. This is nonsense. It's an insult to the Indian public. Why should the Indian public go to the media because they find it dense? They should turn around and say that we will also learn their language and their interests and find out whether they're telling the truth or not. That's how you refute a point of view. And in this controversy that exists, what one really wants is that if people are going to at least object to our or whatever arguments they're objecting to, do it on the basis of reading and thinking and analysis. Don't just say, oh, this is rubbish, and leave it at that. That doesn't make sense. But if there is a proper analysis and reading and argument, then it becomes a worthwhile debate. Then one's ready to debate it.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I think we should have a
I have a question.
round of questions. Yes. One. 2, 3, 4. 4. These are the last 4. Okay? I'm so sorry, but I think we have to close. Otherwise, it's getting. And people have already run out for tea. Anyway.
Hi, Professor Bhattacharya. So, what I'm going to ask dovetails with the exhortations that you were making just now. So, you said that right-wing history, when and only when it is based in facts, when it is based in empirical realities that can be tabulated and verified, then it's kosher. Then at least you would extend or lend some degree of respectability to it. So about a decade ago, there is a book which came out from the academic press. I can't remember the name of the publisher. It's called Creating Medina, by Venkat Dhulipala. So it has essentially, what it has done is that it has traced Pakistan, or given its the undergirding. It is basically saying that Pakistan is actually the Medina of the Muslim mind, and whenever a Muslim metropole gets threatened, by juxtaposing it with what happened way back in the 7th century, when Muhammad was threatened in Makkah, he also shifted to Medina unless he could get powerful enough to again launch back. So Pakistan, in that basically Muslim imagination, is a launch pad for this great Ghazwa that is about to come. Now Faisal Devji has critiqued it. His criticism is basically that it's very retrospective. He is also communalizing. So I just want to understand where do you stand, because when I read the book, I do find that it's based on, because Venkat Dhulipala is producing, he's replicating the heck of speeches by Maulvis and Muftis in the 30s and 40s. That say our position may not be as strong as the Hindus, so let's, for the time being, even if it is a moth-eaten Pakistan, let's have it. So where do you stand vis-a-vis this debate? And also because my reading was that Isa Jalal's famous thesis of sole spokesman, that what Jinnah managed is because of the failure. His rhetoric for Pakistan was mere saber rattling, that he was making these exaggerated claims not so that he would get Pakistan, but he would get representation over and above the Muslim population. So between Isa Jalal and Dhulipala, what's your opinion about it? So if it is based in empirical realities and the data and the speeches, should we accept that
Got the point. Okay, move. Next question.
Yes.
भैया माइक को फटाफट पहुंचाओ. And whoever wants to ask, please quickly stand up so that it goes to you. Yes.
Hello speakers. I am Shubhranil, doing my PhD from CHS. My question is to Romila ma'am and to Neeladri sir. My question is school or school textbook, as we know, is a major instrument of the ideological state apparatus. So when ma'am, you and Neeladri sir, later on you try to produce their school textbook, what was your experience with the state, how you thought to conceptualize state, or what was your experience, or how?
Okay.
May I?
Yeah.
मैम, मेरा सवाल ये था कि मतलब कि जब भी कोई मतलब हिस्टोरियन जो है टेक्स्ट बुक लिख रहा है किसी भी के लिए, मतलब हर कोई किताब जो है किसी ऑडियंस के लिए लिखी जाती है, वैसे ही जब हम कोई टेक्स्ट बुक लिख रहे हैं, ये कौन से स्टूडेंट है वो, मतलब पर्टिकुलरली जब हम एनसीईआरटीज़ की बात करते हैं, मतलब ये क्या वही बच्चे हैं जो आईसीएसई या सेंट्रल बोर्ड स्कूल्स में पढ़ते हैं, क्या उनके लिए लिखी जाती है, और क्या वो बाकी बच्चों का क्या जो स्टेट बोर्ड्स में पढ़ रहे हैं और उन तक वो कौन सी हिस्ट्री पहुंचाई जा रही है? ये मेरा एक सवाल है. क्या यहाँ पे मतलब इकोनॉमी के बेसिस पे डिफरेंस होता है कि आप जो है किन बच्चों को ज़्यादा प्रायोरिटी देते हैं कि जो किसी अच्छे स्कूल में पढ़ रहे हैं जिनको एनसीईआरटी पढ़ाई जा रही है, और दूसरी जगह पे जो बच्चे मतलब सरकारी स्कूल में या स्टेट फंडेड स्कूल में पढ़ रहे हैं? ये मुझे डिफरेंस बताना. और दूसरा एक क्वेश्चन मेरा था, मैम ने बोला कि कोई भी आपको किसी भी फ्रेमवर्क को यूज़ करना होता है और उसको ज़रूरी नहीं है कि आपको उसको प्रूव करना है, आप उसमें से कोई नई चीज़ भी निकाल सकते हैं. तो ये मैम ने बोला. मेरा सवाल ये है, क्या हम एक फ्रेमवर्क के बजाय क्या दो फ्रेमवर्क से कोई चीज़ प्रोड्यूस कर सकते हैं क्या? थैंक यू मैम.
हाँ ठीक है यहाँ इनको दे दो.
Hello, I'm Mehraj, a master student here at CHS. So my question is to all of you speakers, particularly to Dr. Bhattacharya. So my question somewhat connects to the last question. So when I was going through the NCERT textbooks, history, class 6 to 12, a thing that struck me was that there was somewhat of a regional bias in those textbooks. For example, the history of the Northeast was very scantily covered, if at all. And even when we are talking about the Bhakti movement, history of, let's say, Laleshwari, Lal Der of Kashmir, I didn't find references to that. If you talk about Lakshadweep, Andaman Islands, the people who still live in quote-unquote stone ages in the Andaman Islands, there was no reference to that. Well, when you go to popular history spaces like YouTube and social media, there's a lot of talk going on about Sentinel Island, Andaman Island dwellers and what their life and culture is like. So there's a lot of intriguing stuff out there in sort of the margins of the Indian nation state, which probably the history textbook don't cover as much. So what are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Good question. Okay. What else?
Yeah. So my question is to Romila ma'am. Little bit detailed. Indian spirit is very much hagiographic in nature. Most of the
hagiographic in nature.
Be it political rulers, thinkers, leaders or ideologues, there is always an element of succumbing to hagiographic romance to construct a historiography which obfuscates the hegemonic role of history making and history writing. And if we see very acutely debates on history happening currently, even the secular and liberal intelligentsia succumb to hagiographic romance, which is usually seen as the domain of the Hindu right. For example, debates around Akbar as a hero for the secular left, in the same vein Maharana Pratap as a hero of the Hindu right, or for that matter various other historical figures associated with each caste in India, and even for that matter hagiographizing Ambedkar. So how do we as historians do away with this hagiographic tendency of the Indian spirit?
Okay, good. Good question. One last question we're going to take now.
Yeah. I had a question for Professor Bhattacharya, and I mean the rest of the panel can also respond. Professor Bhattacharya, you said that while being in the textbook forming community, one of the important questions you thought about was how historical knowledge is produced. How to communicate this to, say, a student of class 5 or class 7. And I wanted, if you could give a sense of, how that was approached. Because the larger question I'm interested in is do you feel in the recent times with the rampant revisions, the more important question is not to write the correct history, but how to engender the sense that how historical knowledge is produced, how to communicate that to the student rather than telling them what the correct history is. So do you feel that the more urgent question is how to engender this sense that how history is produced to the student? Yeah. Okay.
So this is the last, we are going to close, this is the last round of questions. We're going to close with the Neeladri, will you go on whatever?
Should I say, you said you addressed the question to me. Ancient India. Ancient India is a geographical entity.
I'll ask him to repeat it.
Give him the mic. Constitutive territorial identity, which cannot be understood if we refer to evocative return to our past. That's not the source. Its connection can be understood possibly in terms of how that the legitimacy of a new state, and that's Faisal's argument, how the legitimacy of a new state is established through variety of forms of mythical return to past. And therefore, and that is seen in many other forms of state. The present government seeks to return to mythical past in order to legitimate the politics of today. Nation states everywhere produce a national past in order to legitimate nation states within the country. Pakistan, in its own form, returns to that image of the Medina to talk of the legitimate the present in. So we need to understand the politics of return, the politics of appropriation, politics underlying the appropriation of specific past, and the politics of the use of myth in order to constitute modern state power. And that's something which we need to be all conscious of. The second one was that there was something about the state, which I missed. The second point I could respond to is about how do we deal with many different frameworks? As a historian, when there are many different frameworks, what do we do? And that's, I'm sure all of us will have something to say, that when you have many different frameworks, the first thing is to understand the logic of those frameworks, understand the politics of that framework. What is this framework opening up? What is the way it returns to the past? What is the past it is opening up? What are the assumptions underlying the structure of that framework? What are the questions being asked? When we ask this, we can critique each of these frameworks to develop our independent opinion. It is not that we have to accept one or the other. We can reject both in order to develop our ideas, and a critical relationship, which all of us have been talking about, is an engagement with different kinds of frames to understand what you can accept and what you can reject, and what are the questions you see as valid and which are the questions which are problematic. So in that critical engagement with different frameworks, historians develop new knowledge systems, but even as students of history, we can develop our individual personal ideas through critical engagements. Should I answer the three and then you can take it? Hagiography, different kinds of frames of different scholars within different frameworks, operating with different frameworks, particularly when they talk about history being driven by, or history being shaped by heroes. They return to heroes and often mythicize them. In glorifying heroes, inevitably, whether it is hagiographic or not, what you erase is the problematic deeds of a particular hero, and what you celebrate is what they have done, the good things they have done. So for a complex picture, we obviously need to see both we have to see history in its messiness. We have to see each individual in the many different ways that they ruled and established their power and shaped history. There are problematic things, there are things to be celebrated. So hagiographies only look at the good and erase the bad in some sense. History, how is history produced in relation to sources and historic questions of historical knowledge? How can we give students a sense of that? Instead of telling them about history as truth, it would be better, as the question I can understand, and that's a very important point, that it would be better to tell the student how to think about history, how to pose questions about history, and how to understand that history is produced through an engagement with different kind of sources. So we have to have a respect for the source, but equally a critique of that source as we look at them. And therefore our efforts in the project that we did was to introduce the students to different kinds of sources, but also discuss those sources. What we can use oral history, but there are problems of using oral history. Whose orality are you looking at? What are the questions you asked? What is the answer you got? Each of those things have to be analyzed. Inscriptions are a source of history, but there are ways of looking at inscriptions. Epics are a source of history, but there are ways in which you can analyze the epics, and there are ways in which you cannot analyze the epic. So ways of understanding the questions we ask, the problems of limits of that analysis, is something which we have to convey a sense to. And our effort was to do it through about 13, 14 sources, from chronicles to things like that.
Let me take that. The question on the sources, that I think it's an important one, because in the class 11 textbook of the 2004-5 revised syllabi, that was an attempt to do, that is, when you get to the actual high school, the 11 and 12, sources were introduced, and I remember that it was a fascinating exercise, because I got told to write the chapter for whatever reason, Sanchi came up, and I wrote the monuments ones, and I wrote the one on Sanchi, and it was a terrific learning experience, because Sanchi also meant that you brought in the history of the Bhopal state, the queens came up, the Nawabs came up, and the fact that funding, it's gone down in history as the preservation of monuments has gone down in history as the work of the John Marshalls and the Cunninghams and whatever. But here was a fair amount of money that was given by the Nawab of Bhopal for the contribution that she makes to Sanchi, to the restoration of Sanchi. So it can be actually a very fascinating exercise. And I think Kunal wrote the chapter on the Mahabharata, on the epics. So it was quite an attempt. But it takes me to the other question that was asked, which is how do you actually write a history textbook when you have a very disparate student constituency across the country? You're trying to, where are you teaching this? Maybe it goes to the formal schools, which are like, the English medium, the secondary schools created by whatever. There's a chain of that. Can you actually tell that story only to that set of people? What happens to actually the local histories and the questions that included Andaman Islands and so on? And I remember that Kashmir, Ladakh came up as an area. How do you actually tell a history that is stuck out northeast, stuck in mainland India, which is actually supposed to speak now to students who have no experience of that history and who are actually local? So in a sense, there is a problem with the centralized syllabus. And that is something we must recognize. So NCERT कितना भी कुछ कर ले, at the end of the day, वो छाप उसका रहेगा कि वो तो ऊपर से छाप है ना. It's a national chap. That is a problem that we were faced with. So I think these are challenges, but we could create alternative ways in which that syllabus could be handled. And I think in Ladakh and all, they probably dumped the NCERT syllabus and taught whatever they wanted, at the end of ultimately children will pick up their own relationship to history, not necessarily from the questions that are being set to them from here. So these are challenges, I think, but there were also corrective mechanisms that we would have been able to use within a framework. Now if you reduce it to ye keh sakte ho aur ye nahi keh sakte ho, then you are actually putting down official words. It's like a papal decree. Aaj jo keh raha hai, whatever is happening today, it's like a papal decree which says this is the truth and there's no single truth. That's the problem with the way in which the whole debate around the syllabi has been going. Has everyone's questions been answered?
I think
more or less?
No into it. So
Romila.
Sure. I don't have much to add to it. Just a few asides. The problem with the state, let's not forget that the origins of Indian history as written by the colonial writers posited the absence of the state in India. India never had a state. Therefore, speaking as a historian of ancient pre-modern times, we've had great problems in establishing the viability of the state, because immediately people would turn around and say, oh, but for so long people have been saying that there was no such thing as a state. And one had to say, well, you cannot have a complex society without a state or some kind of authoritative system. And consequently, there have been now some interesting developments in terms of visualizing the origins of the state and the transformations that it underwent in the first 2 millennia of the first 3, in fact, the first millennium BC and the first 2 AD. So the state is very much there, it's very much in history. I don't think it's been ignored, not now, it's not in the moment. Geography also brings to mind migration. In every part of the world, the history of migration has been a foundational history. And there are many histories, many parts of the world where this has been accepted, with some very interesting historical pictures that emerged from the result of migrating groups. Ours is perhaps the one history where there's been a resistance to accepting that migration brings settlement, it brings new cultures, it leads to the evolution of new forms. And I think that the history of geography and of migration is something that needs very much to be researched and to be taught and to be brought into general kinds of histories, because it is crucial to understand. The Kushans came here, what did they do? Other than produce some sculpture? No, they did a whole lot of other things. So please, can we please research that? And it's been a series of migrations. I mean, leave alone the Indo-Aryans, if we don't want to get into that question. You talk about the Shakas and the Kushans and the Huns and the Turushkas, and it goes on. And the difference between those that come in as migrants and settle down, and others like the Brits who refused to settle in India, and all the wealth was taken back to Britain. So these are still areas that need to be researched and to be analyzed and to be brought into the general history. As to the nation state and the boundaries of the nation state, this is something that will go on for a long, long time. All kinds of historical issues come up. In Europe, for example, the whole division between France and Germany, Germany and Poland, the Scandinavian countries, it's an ongoing issue. And it will be an ongoing issue here. I remember going to a conference and talking to a group of historians from Pakistan who were saying, this was some years ago, who were saying, you know, our problem is that there is now a theory that Pakistan really was culturally only associated with Central Asia, not with India. And how do we counter it? So I said, will you counter it by analysis and research and so on? So the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, these questions of territory and theory and so on are historical questions of importance. And we cannot just dismiss them by either saying, this was always our boundary, or by saying that this boundary never existed. And do remember that in pre-cartographic times, the boundary becomes an obsession when maps are made. And you can put a red line on the map and say, this is you and this is me. But prior to that, there were no maps, there were no red lines on maps marking boundaries. What you had very interestingly and differently from now was frontier zones between kingdoms and between cultural groups and what have you. And we should pay a little more attention to these in-between areas, because that's really where the action was, where people came in, settled, met each other, borrowed, lent, etc., etc. And that is the kind of issue in which I think geography plays a very important part in giving a direction to historical research, which has other implications that are very necessary for the total picture of the context of history.
Can I add just one sentence? I just wanted to add one sentence, one observation. I remember JNU library, one was looking at books, and suddenly I came across a book called 5,000 years of Pakistan. And it was written by a very respectable archaeologist, that's Mortimer Wheeler. No. But what is important for us to realize, I mean, our immediate reaction is no, Pakistan was created only in 1947. What we need to realize is that India was also created in 1947. Once we realize it, then probably we'll be doing better quality histories. Thank you.